I still see the first flash from that camera in the dark white light swallowing red stone, then settling to show a wall of old paint and a man seated like he'd just stopped to catch his breath. The air didn't move in there. Even our radio sounded hushed, as if the cave insisted we lower our voices. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I've spent most of my adult life carrying a radio and a map. My office sits on the north side of Flagstaff, a low building where the wind rattles the flag halyard and the coffee is always a little burnt by noon. My days used to move by a simple rhythm patrol check-ins at dawn training hikes on Wednesday's paperwork when the phones quieted after dinner. In spring, the town thaws and the high desert opens trailheads busy by sunrise, trucks dusted red by afternoon, the smell of juniper cut into the air. People come here looking for quiet. Most of them find it and go home. Some don't. Marcus first came across my desk the way careful hikers do in a short, tidy message to our backcountry notification line, 2 weeks planned solo technical sections, expected route notes attached. He didn't call to brag. He called because he understood what these canyons demand. His file was neat. Oregon plates, a Toyota Tacoma with all-terrain tires, satellite device ID base coordinates emergency contact, Sarah Morrison sister. I remember the way he wrote distances like a programmer writing clean code 15 miles to the rim, then variable terrain. His voice on the voicemail was even unhurried, a man who preferred the sound of his own footsteps to conversation. On the mornings I'm not in the field, I drive the county roads before the heat stacks up. Ranch gates clack in the breeze. Cattle pause mid-chew to watch the truck go by. Gas is always scarcer than you think it should be. Cell service comes and goes. The walls of the canyons here rise straight out of the flats, their faces sun-baked and clean, and the light slides across them like the hand of a clock. I try to teach new deputies to read that light the way it lifts at 9 burns at noon, softens toward 5, because out here time isn't just a number, it's how you live. 3 days before he rolled south from Portland, Marcus left a second message with updated coordinates and a calm reminder. Evening check-ins daily, 7:30 p.m., Mountain Time. He spoke like someone who respected rules he set for himself. There are people I worry about the second I hear their plan, the ones who treat the desert like a theme park counting on luck to carry them back to the truck. I didn't put Marcus in that category. He was the kind who marks water on his map with a pencil and checks it again after dinner. I met Sarah the way we meet most families over a phone line from too far away. She asked good questions and wrote down the answers. Seattle in the background sounded gray and damp through the receiver. She wanted to be sure she had the right lat-long format. She wanted to know if daily pings ever missed by an hour. I told her the truth. Satellites skip sometimes. High walls make echoes out of everything. I also told her the pattern matters more than a single dot on a screen. She understood. I could hear it in the way her voice steadied when she repeated the plan back to me. Spring ran normal that year. We pulled 2 out of Oak Creek when snowmelt turned the water cold and fast. A lost ATV rider flagged down a rancher near Blue Grade Road and rode out in the bed of a truck with a sunburn and a story he'd tell too many times. Captain Rodriguez checked anchors on the usual routes in the canyons and came back with grit in her hair, smiling like someone who loves the work. At the office, I signed training requests, reviewed fuel logs, and saved time on the calendar for a Saturday barbecue with my brother's family hot dogs on the grill, mustard on the table, a little baseball on the radio. I like a town where you can still tell the day by what's on the porch. Marcus's truck rolled into our county with a film of road dust and a split map folded on the passenger seat. He tucked the vehicle into the shallow shade of a sandstone outcrop where the wind scours the ground clean. If you've never stood out there, you might not know how heavy the quiet can feel. No engines, no hum, just a hawk somewhere overhead and your own breath. Folks talk about the desert being empty. It isn't. It's full of things that don't much care whether you're there or not. Marcus set a small camp near the truck, the methodical way organized minds do tent lines, squared food, sealed gear in a place you can find in the dark. On my side of the county, the mornings kept starting the way they always had. The flag snapped at the pole. My office calendar got a red circle around a Tuesday meeting. The water cooler hissed and gulped. I can tell you the weight of a map in your hands changes with the call you're expecting, but back then the paper was just paper. The only thing that caught my attention about Marcus early on was how he described the place not just miles, but what the walls looked like. When the light shifted, things only a certain kind of person bothers to notice. Sarah sent a text to the main line the night he reached his first camp. Received ping, "Arrived, weather clear." I answered like I always do, acknowledged. She followed with a photo from their last dinner, a kitchen table with placemats a kid might have picked out, 2 plates scraped clean, an extra fork lying on a folded napkin like someone meant to use it and forgot. There was a note on the counter torn from a grocery list: batteries, coffee, oatmeal. I picture homes by their refrigerators, the magnets and the school pictures and the coupons for pizza places they visit when no one feels like cooking. I held that image for a moment and set the phone face down. The county woke up to a run of warm days. Flagstaff sat at 50 degrees by breakfast and grew into the low 70s by late afternoon. Dust rose from the canyon floors even when the air felt still. On the drive to a training site, Lisa pointed out a thin line on a cliff face where recent freeze-thaw had opened a seam. We talked about flags for the spring briefing. Don't trust last year's anchors, don't assume the same logjam will be where you saw it last. Rock moves. Even stone that looks frozen to the earth is always considering another position. The night Marcus moved from the truck to his spring camp, the office lights cast yellow squares on the parking lot. We locked up at 9, bed. In the morning I poured coffee and checked the overnight messages. His check-in sat there on the screen, short, efficient, the kind of note I'd expect from a man who keeps a list on the inside cover of his notebook. "Camp at Seep," he wrote. "Morning start into main system." I logged it. I highlighted his expected route. I looked out the window and tried to match his sky to mine. You learn a lot about people by the way they start a day in the field. Some blast music at the trailhead. Some take pictures and send them. Marcus didn't do either. He shouldered a pack, tightened the belt with a quick tug, and walked toward a cut in the rock barely wide enough for a person with gear. The first 100 yards in these slots feel like walking into a cathedral at dawn. Air cooler than you expect, sound pushed back toward you, light funneling down in thin streams. The floor is sand and stone and bone-dry driftwood thrown in by floods long gone. Your eyes adjust. Your breathing finds its pace. If you're lucky, you hear the small sounds that tell you what the day wants to be. A pebble ticking down a seam. A tail of wind dragging past your ear. Back in town, my brother called to confirm Saturday. "I'll bring the coleslaw," he said like he always does. I told him I'd bring a bag of ice and a couple extra chairs. I set the phone on the desk and looked at the photo from Sarah again. In it, her kitchen looks like a lot of kitchens clean, but lived in a ceramic bowl of fruit pushed off center, a child's drawing on the freezer door held up by a magnet shaped like a cat. The note about batteries made me think of my own junk drawer, how there's always 3 of one size and none of the other. Small things keep you steady if you let them. Not everything runs smooth even on quiet weeks. A couple from Phoenix missed a turn on the forest roads and burned half a tank trying to relocate themselves by memory. We sent them a pin and a deputy with a tow strap just in case. A hiker called from a ridge with sun blindness and the thick tongue of early heat exhaustion. We walked him down slow and fed him water, a mouthful at a time, until the color came back to his face. Work like that settles into your muscles, steady hands, patient, steps, voices low and plain. I keep my notes in a battered logbook, thin lines, dates in the margin, names spelled carefully. On the page where I'd written Chen Marcus Spring Route, There's a faint pencil dot next to a time in the evening and a second line later in a lighter hand. I remember the moment I wrote it, not alarm, exactly more like running your thumb along a seam in a board and feeling the slightest lift under the paint. He'd promised a 7:30 p.m. check-in each night. On the third evening, I looked at the clock and said nothing to anyone, just changed the angle of the notebook on my desk so it faced me square. The wind came up that night, not hard, just enough to rattle the blinds and make the flag rope clack against the pole. I walked outside and listened to it for a minute. In this job, you collect sounds the way some people collect records. What a dry wash says before a storm moves in the different ways. Boots talk to stone depending on the grit on the sole. How a radio feels in your hand when the room gets quieter on its own. I stood under that pole and watched the line kick and fall, like it had a rhythm it kept, whether I was there to hear it or not. Sarah sent a small message at 8:05 p.m. No alarm in it, just a check mark and a heart the way families sign off when habits are still intact. I answered with a thumbs up and a short, "We're here." I sat in my chair and waited for the familiar buzz on the desk that marks another ping landing where it should. The building hums differently after 9. The soda machine wheezes and rests. The copy room carries its own recycled paper smell. Somewhere in the parking lot, a night insect taps itself senseless against a bulb. By 10, I'd drawn a thin box around the canyon system on the map and labeled it with the day's date. Nothing unusual about the box. We make them all the time boundaries to keep our minds from slipping into the vast. I closed the logbook and slid it under the radio so it wouldn't leave in my hands when I walked out of the room. On my way home, I took the long route up past the ridgeline where you can see the town spread low and dim. Porch lights formed a loose constellation, small stars that say, "A house is waiting up for somebody." It was a warm night that carried the smell of dust and cut grass. At the four-way, the light turned red and held their empty crossroads on all sides. I rested my wrist on the wheel and watched the signal count its silent time. When I finally stepped through my front door, the house gave back the same sound it always does. One slow, settling creak in the hallway, then quiet. I set my phone face up on the kitchen table so I could see it if the screen lit. In the corner, my boot bag leaned against the wall, one lace fallen loose to the floor like a line drawn without a ruler. I checked the back door, then the deadbolt on the front. The clock on the stove rolled over to 10:31 p.m. I left the porch light on more habit than hope. Soft yellow pooling on concrete moths, hanging in the glow, the yard beyond it falling into black. The phone sat in its rectangle of light and did not move. Somewhere out in the county, a coyote called once and stopped, and the night held its breath. The porch light was still burning when I walked into the office the next morning. The map on my desk hadn't moved, but something in me had. I checked the time on the wall clock, 6:57 a.m., and opened the logbook to the last note I'd written the night before. The square I'd drawn around the canyon sat there like a question. I turned on the radio, half expecting the soft static of a new ping from Marcus's device, but there was nothing, just the hum of the building warming in the morning sun. Sometimes that silence means a system hiccup or a missed orbit. I'd seen it a dozen times. But for reasons I couldn't name yet, it didn't feel like that this time. By 9, I called Sarah. She answered on the second ring voice, soft but alert. "No message yet," she said before I could ask. I heard kitchen sounds in the background, her husband moving plates, kids murmuring somewhere off to the side. She tried to sound casual, but I could hear the tightness under her words. "He's probably out of range," I told her. "That canyon has dead spots." I meant it. Still, after I hung up, I kept looking at the empty space next to his last coordinates. By sunset that day, there was still nothing. Then the next morning came, and still nothing again. I logged the lapse, and protocol took over. After 24 hours without contact, we moved from monitoring to action. I called Captain Rodriguez, told her we might have a developing situation out in the gulch. She sighed quietly on the other end. No surprise, no drama, just the weight of what that meant. "I'll assemble a team," she said. "We'll head out at first light." I sent Sarah a text letting her know we were treating it as a precaution. She replied almost immediately, "I'm driving down." That first day of the search felt longer than it had any right to. Lisa's team rolled out from Flagstaff at dawn, 6 rescuers, 2 deputies, 1 paramedic, plus 2 all-terrain vehicles loaded with supplies. The dirt roads out there test every bolt on a truck. By the time they reached Marcus's trailhead, the sun was already leaning hard across the sky. His Tacoma sat right where he'd left it, thin dust coating the windshield, keys in the ignition, door unlocked. That's standard for experienced hikers. Don't make someone break a window if they have to get inside in an emergency. His map was laid out on the passenger seat, marked neatly with pencil notations, and a small stack of fuel receipts in the console. Everything in order, as if he planned to come back. Lisa radioed me the details. "No sign of struggle," she said. "He's just gone." They made camp by the truck that night the way we always do in those first stages. Light discipline, 1 lantern on low logs written out before bed. She said the air out there was dry enough to make your lips split, the kind of dry that drinks the sound right out of a person's voice. I stayed at the office with the maps. The room had that hollow echo it gets when the phones stop ringing for the night. The overhead lights buzzed softly, and every so often I caught myself staring at the contour lines on the page, tracing the curves of the canyons with a pen like they could answer back. At dawn, the team began the 15-mile approach on foot. It's hard to explain that landscape to someone who's never walked it. From a distance, it looks empty, flat, featureless, but when you're down in it, it's a living maze of ridges, gullies, and rock corridors that twist like they're trying to confuse you. The desert doesn't care how good your GPS is. It decides what it wants to show you. Lisa's team reached Marcus's first camp near the Seep late that afternoon. The evidence of his stay was unmistakable, a flattened patch of sand where his tent had been a small ring of stones from a cooking fire and a few empty water bottles stacked neatly in the shade. There was no damage, no sign of panic. But his backup battery and satellite charger were still there, and that's when Lisa's voice changed. "If he planned to explore for more than a day, he'd have taken these," she said. "Whatever happened, he didn't expect to be gone long." I relayed the update to Sarah when she reached Flagstaff that evening. She and her husband had driven straight through from Seattle, 20 hours on the road, no sleep. She looked smaller than I remembered from our video call. Grief shrinks people even before it has proof. We sat together in the conference room, maps spread across the table. She ran her finger along the contour lines where the canyon branched in 3 directions. "He would have gone toward the middle," she said. "He mentioned pictographs in one of his emails." I nodded. "That's where we'll focus tomorrow." She stared at the red pen marks, eyes unfocused. "He's alive," she said softly. "He has to be. He knows what he's doing." I didn't argue. Sometimes faith keeps families upright long enough for us to do our jobs. By the 3rd day, we had more than 20 people in the field. The radio traffic came in bursts, coordinates, updates, small victories like finding a footprint in damp sand or a piece of gear half buried in silt. The canyon walls threw our signals around like they were playing games, and half the time we had to climb a ridge just to hear one another. Mid-morning on the 4th day, Lisa's voice broke through the static. "We've got something," she said. "Right branch about a mile in." I felt my pulse jump. "What kind of something?" I asked. She paused. "A trekking pole. Carbon fiber. Looks like it scraped through a tight spot." The team logged the coordinates, photographed it, and kept searching. That single object, a stick of metal and plastic, became our anchor. It meant he'd been alive at least that far in, but it also meant he might have pushed into territory we hadn't mapped yet. The days bled together after that. Helicopters scanned the canyon from above, cameras and thermal sensors sweeping every crevice, but the terrain was deceptive. From the air, it looks like one continuous scar of red stone. But inside those walls, there are hidden alcoves, places even light has trouble finding. We brought in dog teams, though. The wind patterns in slot canyons make scent tracking almost impossible. The animals would alert, then lose it, circle back and lie down confused. By nightfall each day, the teams came back coated in red dust eyes, squinting from the glare. They'd sit around the field radios, half-whispering theories. Maybe he fell into a vertical shaft. Maybe flash flood debris covered him. Maybe he doubled back and we just missed it. The worst part wasn't the exhaustion. It was the silence. We're trained for chaos, not for a world that gives no answers. On the 9th day, Command made the call to scale back operations. You'd think it gets easier with experience, but it doesn't. Every time you reach that point, it feels like walking out on someone who might still be waiting. I delivered the briefing myself in the small press room downtown. Cameras clicked, a few reporters nodded politely, and I said the lines I've had to say too many times. We have exhausted our immediate search capabilities. The case remains active and open. Afterward, I found Sarah standing outside by the railing. The sun was low, coloring the streets that dull copper Arizona gets right before dusk. She didn't cry. She just looked at me and said, "You're not giving up." It wasn't a question. I told her I wasn't. The days that followed were quieter, but not in a comforting way. Sarah stayed in Flagstaff, renting a small room near the interstate. She spent her time reading maps, combing through hiking forums, writing emails to anyone who had ever posted about Coyote Gulch. Every night she'd stop by the office with a few new printouts, some theory or lead she'd found online. Most went nowhere, but I never told her to stop. I've seen what hope does for people. It's both a light and a knife. Summer came on fast. The canyons shimmered in the heat like something alive. A few of us still ran informal searches on our days off, retracing old paths. Each time I went out there, I felt the same strange pull, like the landscape itself was holding something back. I started sleeping less. When I did, I dreamed of canyons with walls that closed in and floors that shifted under my boots. Sometimes in those dreams, Marcus was ahead of me, turning a corner just as I reached for him, always too far to touch. In August, an email landed in my inbox from a geology professor named Janet Weiss. She'd been following the case and had a theory. She believed the region was laced with ancient caves formed by underground water flow, some of which might not appear on any modern maps. If he found one, she wrote, he could have gone in thinking it was a short chamber. Those systems can extend for miles. I called her that afternoon. Her voice was calm, precise. "This area swallows people, Detective," she said. "It's done it before." She sent me historical records of other disappearances. Researchers, hikers, explorers, all within 50 miles of the same region. Every file ended the same way, never recovered. I forwarded her report to Sarah, unsure if it would comfort or crush her. She came by that evening, hair pulled back, dark circles under her eyes. If he found a cave, she said he would have gone in. He was curious like that. I nodded. Dr. Weiss thinks there could be hundreds out there. Sarah looked down at the map at all those empty spaces and whispered, "Then we'll look in all of them." By October, reality caught up. The official funding ended. The teams were reassigned. I helped Sarah file the paperwork to manage Marcus's affairs lease bank account storage unit. It was one of the hardest meetings I've ever sat through. The courthouse was quiet that day, just the two of us in a small wood-paneled room. The judge spoke softly, signing each form with practiced detachment. I watched Sarah's hand tremble slightly as she wrote her name. The law calls it a conservatorship, but what it really means is acknowledging a loss you still can't believe. That winter, she started working with volunteer search groups who specialized in cold cases. Technology had advanced since our original efforts: LiDAR mapping, drone surveys, 3D terrain models. I joined some of the planning calls. It gave us something to hold on to. February brought new hope. Fresh scans of the canyon showed what looked like several potential cave entrances high up on the right branch, places we hadn't been able to reach before. The images weren't perfect, but they were enough to make the hair rise on the back of my neck. I remember sitting in the darkened office, the map glowing on the screen. Those shapes in the cliff face looked like shadows at first, but the longer I stared, the more I realized what I was seeing: openings narrow but real. I could almost hear the echo of a man's footsteps in there, the quiet click of a camera shutter against stone. I printed the image, folded it into my logbook, and placed it beside the entry with his last coordinates. For the first time in nearly a year, the silence in that room felt less like an ending and more like a breath being held waiting. When spring returned, so did Sarah. She walked into my office with a look I'd come to recognize: not peace, not hope exactly, but determination sharpened by grief. "They're planning a new expedition," she said. "Dr. Weiss's team. They want to check those caves." I could tell she'd already decided she was going. "It's been a year," she added quietly, "but I still feel like he's out there." I didn't tell her I felt it too. Some places stay with you. Some names don't let go. I promised I'd help however I could, permits coordination, anything to get them out there safely. As she left the room, I glanced at the map on the wall at that same right branch we'd stared at for months. The evening light fell across it, turning the paper gold. For a moment, I thought of Marcus sitting in the sand, camera in hand, seeing that same color against stone. By then, it had been 352 days since his last message. The canyon had gone through a year of wind and rain, carving itself just a little deeper, burying whatever it chose to keep. But the desert has its own sense of mercy. It hides, but it also preserves. And standing there in that quiet office, I had the distinct, uneasy feeling that the canyon hadn't finished its story yet. The spring air carried that same dry stillness when Sarah returned to Arizona. The kind of quiet that feels charged, like the land itself remembers what you're about to ask of it. She walked into my office just after sunrise with a folded map under her arm and an exhaustion that seemed to hang from her shoulders. "They're ready," she said. It took me a second to realize she meant the cave specialists, the team Dr. Weiss had assembled. I nodded and pushed a mug of coffee across the desk. She didn't sit down right away. She just stood there looking at the wall map of Coyote Gulch like it was something alive. The canyons had been scanned again with new imaging equipment, and what those maps showed, the dark voids and fractures, looked like veins under skin. After all that time, after everything we'd done, there were still places we hadn't seen. Cave Rescue International arrived a week later. They came in quiet, efficient, the way veteran crews do. Ropes, harnesses, sensors, gas detectors, gear laid out with the precision of habit. The lead captain, Michael Torres, was a tall man with gray in his beard and the calm, low tone of someone who'd spent half his life underground. "We'll start with the marked voids from the LiDAR scans," he told me. "Work our way east. Nothing romantic about it, just patience and safety." He had that same weary respect for the land I'd come to know. People think the desert's barren, but it's not. It hides everything. Sarah decided to stay in Flagstaff while the team worked, though I could tell every hour was a test. She set up in the same hotel room she'd used during the first search, a small space off Route 66 with a view of the Red Hills. She kept her phone on the nightstand, waiting for calls that came mostly from me or Dr. Weiss. The professor had joined the expedition herself, drawn by the geological mystery of the area. I liked her immediately. She had that measured patience scientists get when they've spent too many years waiting for rock to give up its secrets. By the second day, the first 3 caves had been examined and cleared. Short passages, some with animal bones or old debris, nothing human. Torres radioed in each evening with the same even tone, cataloging each site by number, coordinates, and depth. No speculation, no color, just facts. That's what keeps you grounded out here. But I could feel Sarah's hope stretching thin. She'd start each morning staring at her phone before it rang, and every night she'd ask the same quiet question. Anything yet? There's no right way to answer that. On the fourth morning, the team targeted one of the deeper voids, an entrance hidden in the right branch of the canyon, the same direction Marcus's trekking pole had been found a year earlier. It wasn't even a visible cave at first glance, just a thin vertical crack halfway down a 200-foot cliff face, nearly impossible to spot unless the light hit it just right. The descent alone took most of the morning. Torres kept his radio open the whole time. His voice came through, broken by static. "Surface team, this is Torres. I'm about 70 feet from the opening. Visibility fair. Air temp reads stable." We listened from base camp, a small cluster of tents in the canyon floor's shade. The line hissed again, then steadied. "All right," he said, entering the void. Minutes passed like hours. Every so often the line crackled with a word or two. "Narrow passage. Seems to widen. Air moving." That last part caught my attention. Airflow meant there was another chamber deeper in. I looked over at Dr. Weiss. She was crouched near the radio, her face pale in the reflected light from the equipment. That could indicate multiple exits, she murmured mostly to herself. I could hear Torres again. "I'm about 50 meters in now. Floor's sandy stable. Hold on." Static. Then his voice returned lower, slower. "I see prints. Human, I think. Definitely boot tread." The camp fell silent. You could hear the wind shift across the rocks, a low, steady hum that felt ancient. Torres spoke again, quieter now, his tone changing in a way I've only heard a few times in my life. "There's a chamber up ahead," he said. You're going to want to see this." Then a long pause, followed by words that felt like they'd come from somewhere far away. "I've found him." I don't remember breathing for a while after that. The channels stayed open, faint shuffling noises carrying through. "He's seated," Torres said, "upright against the wall. Preserved. Looks like he sat down and never got up again." I looked at Dr. Weiss, who had closed her eyes. "Tell them to hold position," I said. "No movement until we plan extraction." The professor nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her notebook. The radio crackled once more, softer this time. "There's something else," Torres said. "You're not going to believe these walls." It took nearly 2 hours to secure the entrance for more personnel to descend. The climb was technical, the kind of work that leaves your muscles trembling even after you're still. When I finally followed the line down, the air changed halfway, in a still, dry coolness that felt separate from the world above. My light fell across the chamber floor first, then the figure against the far wall. Marcus sat with his back to the stone head, tilted slightly, hands resting on his pack as if waiting out a storm. Time had barely touched him. The desert had kept its promise. But what struck me most wasn't Marcus. It was the walls. Every surface glowed with faded red, black, and ochre shapes. Human figures, animals, spirals, stars. Ancient paint thousands of years old. Some of it was so detailed it seemed fresh. I'd seen rock art before, but never like this. It felt deliberate, sacred. Torres whispered beside me, his voice catching. "He found a cathedral," he said, and that's exactly what it was, a place where the past still breathed. Dr. Weiss joined us later that afternoon, carefully maneuvering into the chamber. When her light reached the walls, she froze. "My God," she said softly. "These span multiple eras, different styles layered together." She crouched near a lower section, running her hand through the air, not touching. Some of these might predate anything documented in this region. Her voice broke slightly. He must have realized what he found. We examined Marcus's gear methodically. His camera was beside him, battery long dead lens cap off. Inside his pack, neatly folded, was a small leather journal still intact. I didn't open it there. Some things deserve daylight. But when we did later, it told the story we already feared. The entry was calm, almost peaceful. He'd written about the discovery, about the rock art, about feeling like he'd stumbled into a place meant to be hidden. Then the tone shifted. The passage he used to enter had collapsed behind him. He couldn't move the rocks alone. He still had food, water, and light for a few days, and he'd written about trying to find another exit near the upper wall. His handwriting grew weaker near the end, but the last lines were steady. "The chamber is good air. I'll keep documenting. Maybe this is how I was meant to see it." It's one thing to imagine someone's final hours. It's another to stand in the space where they happened. The silence down there was almost kind. No sound of wind, no dripping water, just a dry, suspended stillness, the kind of quiet that feels eternal. We worked for 3 days to recover him, moving carefully to avoid disturbing the site. Tribal representatives were brought in early after photos confirmed the significance of the art. They stood with us during the final lift, heads bowed. "He didn't die alone," one of them said quietly. "The ancestors were here." When Sarah arrived, I met her at the base of the canyon before she reached the cave. The climb was too technical for her to go in, and I think she knew that. She stood beside me in the afternoon heat, both hands gripping the brim of her hat. "Did he suffer?" she asked. I told her no, that it looked like he'd gone peacefully, that the conditions had preserved him in a kind of stillness. She closed her eyes and nodded. "He always said he felt more alive out here than anywhere else," she whispered. Maybe that's where he wanted to end up. There was nothing to say to that. We just stood together, the canyon stretching around us, the wind moving through like a sigh. Later that night, when the last of the team had returned to camp, I sat by the fire with Dr. Weiss. She stared into the flames, face drawn and reflective. "You realize what he found," she said. "This chamber, it's an unbroken record of human presence spanning thousands of years. Generations of people came here for reasons we can only guess." I nodded, still seeing Marcus sitting there, the beam of my flashlight touching his shoulder. "He didn't just vanish," I said quietly. "He became part of it. The official report would later call it an accidental entrapment, no negligence, no foul play. But those words don't capture the truth of it. What happened to Marcus wasn't just tragedy. It was something older, deeper. He'd gone searching for silence and found a kind of immortality instead. The recovery took nearly a week. Every item cataloged, every inch photographed. Marcus's final photographs turned out clear despite the darkness frames of rock art under the pale cone of his headlamp textures that shimmered like living fire. Those images now rest in the museum archive, but I still have one copy in my office, a single photo of the chamber's far wall where 2 painted figures face each other with open hands. Between them, in faint pigment, is a shape that could be a sun or a doorway. When the operation ended, we sealed the entrance under agreement with the tribal council. Not a closure, just a pause, a breath before proper study. As I rode out of the canyon that evening, the setting sun washed the cliffs in copper light, the same color that marked those ancient drawings. The wind had settled, and for the first time in months, the desert didn't feel like it was holding its breath. That night I called Sarah. She answered on the first ring. "He's coming home," I said. She didn't reply for a long time, just the faint sound of her breathing through the line. Then, quietly, "Thank you." I sat there after hanging up the night cool against the open window. Out beyond town, the desert stretched endless and dark, and I couldn't help but think of that chamber beneath it, all those painted walls, that silent figure. A man who'd gone looking for the oldest language there is, and in some way had found it. Still, even as peace settled in, something kept tugging at me. Maybe it was the unanswered question of how he'd found that narrow opening in the first place, or maybe it was the simple truth that the desert never tells its stories all at once. When I closed my eyes that night, I could still see that faint shape on the wall between the 2 painted figures, a sun or a doorway, and I wondered what else waited behind it, still hidden in the stone. The sun was just starting to break over the canyon when the recovery team began the climb out. The air was cool and still, the kind of stillness that feels almost sacred, like the desert itself was holding its breath. I stood near the base of the ridge, watching as they moved carefully up the line, one slow ascent at a time, a shape swaying beneath the rope, wrapped and secure. Marcus's body, preserved by the air that had claimed him, was finally leaving the ground that had kept him a secret for a year. There was no applause, no words exchanged, just the steady creak of harnesses and the soft rasp of rope sliding over stone. When his form cleared the last ledge, I looked down at my boots, then back at the sky. Out here, grief doesn't make a sound. It just settles in layer by layer, like dust after a windstorm. Once Marcus was out, the work changed from search to preservation. The chamber itself became the focus, and every inch of it demanded reverence. Archaeologists, cultural liaisons, and law enforcement all had to share the same narrow ground. For the next several weeks, we lived in that fragile balance between science and mourning. I helped coordinate the documentation effort, photographs, air samples, cataloging every detail before time could take its toll. Dr. Weiss was relentless, though never careless. She treated those walls the way a priest handles a sacred text. I'd watch her trace her light across the pictographs, her face reflected in the stone, whispering to herself as if the answers were buried just under the surface. This place outlived its makers, she told me one evening, her voice low, and now it's outlived him, too. The forensic team from Flagstaff arrived later that week. They examined Marcus's remains under the watchful eyes of tribal representatives who had been brought in from across the region. The Navajo Hopi and Havasupai all sent delegates, each one offering guidance on how to honor what we'd found. I'd seen plenty of death investigations, but never one that required this kind of care. Every photograph, every movement, every word spoken had to pass through quiet consensus. There was no argument in that canyon, only the shared understanding that we were guests in a place older than memory. Dr. Rodriguez, the county medical examiner, worked methodically, noting details as the afternoon light shifted. She confirmed what most of us already suspected: Marcus had died of dehydration compounded by cold. No trauma, no foul play, just a man sealed in a tomb of air and stone. When she spoke, it was soft, respectful. He didn't fight it, she said. You can tell by the way his hands are resting. It was calm. Sarah had chosen not to come down for the examination, and I didn't blame her. She'd already seen enough. Still, I made sure to call her that night. She answered on the first ring. "Did they find what happened?" she asked. I told her the truth about the collapse, the conditions, the fact that he probably never felt pain. There was a long silence before she said, "Then he got the peace he was looking for." When Marcus was finally released back to the surface world, the transport felt less like an investigation and more like a ceremony. The tribal representatives offered prayers in their own languages before he was moved. No one spoke for several minutes afterward. The desert absorbed the sound, leaving only wind against the rock, the faint whisper of sand shifting at our feet. As we carried his body toward the vehicles, the sun dipped behind the canyon rim, turning the sky the same deep red as the walls that had watched over him. Back in Flagstaff, I sat in the small break room of the sheriff's office while Dr. Weiss prepared her preliminary report. She looked exhausted but alive in a way I hadn't seen before. "You realize this changes everything," she said quietly. "We've been mapping this region for decades and never knew this chamber existed. It's not just a find, it's a record of human history that stretches back thousands of years." She looked up at me, then eyes steady. Marcus didn't just die in there. He rediscovered something the world had forgotten. It took nearly 6 months to process all the data. Carbon dating confirmed that the oldest pictographs were from around 3,000 years ago, with others layered across centuries. Each image told a story, some of animals, some of celestial events, others of human figures in ritual postures. The consistency was astonishing. It was as if generation after generation had returned to this one chamber to add their voices to an ongoing conversation with the land. I began to understand what Weiss meant when she called it a record of humanity. Marcus hadn't stumbled into emptiness. He'd walked into continuity. The geological reports came next. Structural engineers studied the cave and determined the collapse that trapped Marcus had been a natural event triggered by cycles of freeze and thaw that had weakened the rock for years. It could have happened to anyone who passed through at the wrong moment. Knowing that didn't make it easier to accept. I kept thinking about the way he'd sat down to write the deliberate calm of those final entries. There's something about that kind of acceptance that stays with you. The tribal consultations brought a deeper perspective to everything. The representatives explained that many of the symbols Marcus found were still part of oral traditions carried by their elders. Some matched stories about the origins of light of journeys between worlds of people speaking to the sky. I remember one elder, Thomas Yazzie, standing before the assembled group of officials and researchers during a meeting in the chamber months later. He said, "This place is a doorway. Those who come here are chosen not by us, but by the land." No one spoke after that. Even Dr. Weiss, who spent her life in rational disciplines, just nodded. "Maybe he was drawn here," she said later, almost to herself. Sarah came back for a small service we held near the canyon's edge. The county, the tribes, and a few of us who had worked the case gathered quietly as the wind blew through the grass. She wore a simple black jacket, her hair pulled back, no makeup. She stood apart at first, looking out over the horizon. When it was time, she spoke briefly. "Marcus believed the wild was where truth lived," she said. "He used to tell me that silence isn't empty. It's full of answers if you're patient enough." Her voice broke only once. Then she placed a small wooden carving at the base of a juniper tree, something one of her children had made. "So he'll never be alone," she said softly. After the service, I drove her back to town. The highway stretched endless ahead of us, the road shimmering in the late afternoon heat. She stared out the window most of the way. When we reached the outskirts of Flagstaff, she finally spoke. "Do you think he knew what he was finding?" I thought about it before answering. "I think he understood enough to stop looking," I said. She turned toward me, then, eyes tired but clear. "Then maybe that's what peace looks like." The months that followed blurred into reports and briefings, paperwork that tried to make sense of something that resisted explanation. The case file closed officially in October, accidental entrapment, no evidence of foul play. But the investigation into the chamber continued. Dr. Weiss secured funding for a long-term study working with the tribes to establish protections and research protocols. The site would remain sealed except to authorized teams. I helped write the access agreement myself, balancing preservation with respect. It wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about stewardship. When the press release finally went out, the story spread farther than we expected. People from all over the country wrote letters, some curious, some reverent, a few skeptical. But the tone was different from the usual chatter that follows these kinds of discoveries. There was a quiet awe in the responses, a sense that Marcus's story had touched something universal. I think people recognized in him a reflection of themselves, the part that wants to step beyond the noise and find something ancient and unbroken. I went back to the canyon once more before the final sealing of the entrance. The air was cooler that morning, the sky a clear pale blue. The workers had already installed the protective gate, discreet, designed to blend into the rock. I stood a few feet from it, hand resting on the metal. The ground around me was littered with fine red dust that shimmered like rust in the sun. I thought about Marcus down there a year earlier, sitting against the wall, drawing his final breath while surrounded by stories older than language. There was a strange comfort in knowing he'd become part of the very history he loved. Before I left, I placed a small object beside the gate, a simple compass, the kind we give new deputies during orientation. It wasn't meant as an offering, just a gesture. A reminder that direction isn't always found by turning north. Sometimes it's about knowing when to stop moving. The wind picked up, scattering a swirl of sand across the ledge, erasing my footprints within seconds. Back in town, the sun dipped low as I parked outside the station. Through the window, I could see the framed photograph Dr. Weiss had sent me, one of Marcus's last images, the one showing the two painted figures facing each other across the stone. Between them, that faint shape, round and radiant, sat like a sun suspended in the middle of the frame. I often catch myself staring at it when the office goes quiet, wondering what he saw in that moment. There's a line in his journal I haven't shared with anyone outside the case. It's written faintly near the last page in handwriting that wavers but never breaks. He wrote, "The ancient ones understood what we forget, that death is not departure, but return." I think about that sometimes, especially on the nights when the desert wind carries that same dry whisper through town. It's not grief anymore, not exactly. It's something older. When the first autumn storm rolled across Coconino, lightning flashed above the mesas, lighting the sky the same color as that red canyon. The rain came down hard, washing dust from the air. Somewhere beyond the horizon, water would be finding its way into those old passages again, tracing paths through the rock just as it had for millennia. Nature reclaiming its rhythm. The story felt complete, yet I knew better than to call anything finished in this line of work. The desert never ends a story, it just pauses, waiting for the next person willing to listen. Still before the night closed in, I stepped outside the office and looked west. The sky was clearing streaks of gold breaking through the gray. I thought of Sarah, of her children, of Dr. Weiss, cataloging every mark left on those chamber walls. And I thought of Marcus, how he'd entered that canyon searching for silence, and in doing so, left behind a voice that will echo for centuries. Even now, a year later, when the wind moves just right, I swear I can hear it. A low murmur carried through sand and stone. Not a haunting, not sorrow, but something like gratitude. And every time I hear it, I wonder if that chamber deep beneath the desert still remembers the sound of his last breath. The storm that rolled in that night didn't last long. By morning, the sky had cleared and the ground still carried that faint smell of wet dust the desert only releases after rain. I drove out early, the kind of morning where the road feels endless and the horizon seems to wait for you to catch up. It had been months since we sealed the entrance to the chamber, but I still found myself heading in that direction without meaning to. I guess some places get into your bones. The gate stood where we left it, blending into the rock, quiet and unassuming. A single wildflower had managed to bloom near its base, pale yellow against the red sand. I sat for a long while, just watching the light move across the canyon walls, thinking about how the world keeps going, no matter what we lose. It's something I've learned over years of doing this work. The earth doesn't stop for us. It absorbs, remembers, and moves forward. It was the same for Marcus. The land had taken him, kept him safe, and when it was time, gave him back. Sarah called me not long after the gate was sealed. Her voice sounded different, lighter, though still carrying that hollow space grief leaves behind. She told me she'd decided to stay in Seattle for good, close to her kids. She wanted to focus on living, not on the empty chair at the table. Marcus wouldn't want a shrine, she said. He'd want movement. I believed her. She's been working with Dr. Weiss since then, helping organize the outreach and funding for the research foundation they created in his name, the Chen Coyote Project. It's dedicated to mapping uncharted wilderness zones and improving satellite coverage for hikers, but also to teaching something quieter, respect for the land. The kind that doesn't come from fear, but from understanding. Dr. Weiss still writes me sometimes short notes on old-fashioned letterhead. She says the analysis continues, that new symbols keep revealing themselves under light filters patterns that might connect the art in that chamber to sites hundreds of miles away. She sounds less like a scientist these days, and more like someone who's learned to pray. Every time I'm there, she wrote once, I can feel that place breathing. It's as if Marcus just stepped out for a moment. I know what she means. Some silences don't end, they just change shape. The sheriff's office framed one of Marcus's photographs for the hallway display. Two painted figures reaching toward each other across the stone, the faint shape of that sun or doorway between them. I pass it every day on my way to the conference room. Most people don't stop to look. They just walk past, busy with reports and phones and lives that keep moving. But every so often someone new asks what it is, and I tell them about the man who went looking for the quiet and found something eternal. Not everyone gets it. That's all right. The story's not for everyone. I think about the early days sometimes, before the silence, before the canyon took him. How careful Marcus had been, how neatly he packed his gear. How every note in his logbook was a line of calm order. He believed in preparation and control. I think he thought if he respected the desert enough, it would return the favor. Maybe it did, just not in the way any of us expected. We always talk about loss like it's the end of something, but sometimes it's just a change of form. The same way water disappears into sand and later rises again as mist. Sarah told me she's been visiting schools speaking to young hikers about her brother's story. She doesn't use words like tragedy or accident. She calls it a reminder that curiosity and humility have to walk together. She's even taken her kids camping again, something she swore she'd never do. I don't want them to be afraid of the wild, she said. I just want them to know how to listen to it. The county eventually installed a small plaque near the trailhead. It's simple, no headlines, no drama. Just his name, dates, and a line from his journal. The silence is not empty. People leave small things there, stones, feathers, folded notes. I stop by when I can. I never touch what's left. The desert knows how to handle tributes. It takes what it needs and scatters the rest. For me, life went on the way it always does in this line of work. More calls, more searches, more families waiting by phones. I still coordinate the rescue teams, still drive the same roads. But this case changed something in me. Before Marcus, I thought the job was about bringing people home. Now I understand it's also about learning when the land has claimed someone as its own. You can't fight that. You can only witness it and do your best to honor the exchange. There's one night I keep coming back to a few weeks after the discovery, when we were all still raw. I was driving back from the canyon, the sky black and full of stars. Somewhere along the highway, I turned off the headlights for a moment. The desert stretched out ahead of me, silver in the starlight, utterly still. And in that silence, I swear I could almost hear his voice, not words, just the rhythm of breathing, the sound of someone content to be exactly where they are. I turned the lights back on and kept driving, but that sound stayed with me. Time has a way of smoothing the edges of things. The shock fades. The paperwork ends, but the feeling doesn't. It lingers like the faint echo of a bell long after the sound should have gone. Sometimes it's the smallest things that bring it back, a gust of dry wind through an open door, a flash of red dust on my windshield, the smell of rain on rock. When that happens, I stop and let it settle. I think that's the least we can do for the people we've lost, let their memory interrupt our ordinary days. Dr. Weiss once told me she believes the chamber still holds stories we can't see, that the light will eventually reveal more layers of paint, maybe even writing hidden beneath. She said it with a kind of wonder, like a child seeing snow for the first time. Maybe Marcus wasn't trapped, she said quietly. Maybe he was chosen to witness it one last time. I didn't answer, but the thought stayed with me. Maybe some people are meant to find what the rest of us can't bear to look for. As for me, I'm still here. Still working the radio, still tracing names on maps, still waiting for the next call that says someone didn't come home. I don't chase closure anymore. I think the word itself is a myth. What we really find when we're lucky is understanding, and even that comes slow. Sometimes on cool evenings I drive back out to the overlook near Coyote Gulch. I sit in the truck with the window down and watch the last light fade off the cliffs. The world turns gold, then red, then disappears into blue. When the wind shifts, I can smell the sage and the faint metallic scent of the canyon stone. I imagine the chamber below sealed and silent, the painted walls still waiting in the dark. And somewhere in that stillness, a man who loved the wilderness enough to trust it completely. People ask me now and then if I believe in ghosts. I tell them I don't, not in the way movies mean it. But I do believe the land remembers. I think the wind carries fragments of every story that's ever touched it. And sometimes, if you listen closely, those stories find their way back to you. I've learned that remembrance isn't about holding on to sorrow. It's about keeping the truth alive long enough for it to become something else, something that steadies you. Marcus's truth wasn't about death. It was about discovery, about the quiet courage it takes to face the unknown and see beauty there. That's what stays with me. The desert has its own language. It speaks in silence, in shadow, in the spaces between. Marcus heard it, and in doing so left behind a message the rest of us are still trying to translate. Every time I walk those trails now, I try to listen, not for answers, but for the reminder that we're guests here, that everything we touch eventually returns to the same earth. So when I stand at the overlook and the wind moves through the canyon, I let it pass over me without a word. Somewhere below in the hidden dark, the past still breathes, and in that breath there's peace. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for clicks, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.